So I'm happy to open the fourth session that deals with memory of the Jewish past in Poland and in Israel. We have two speakers in this session. One is Jolanta Ambrosewicz-Jacobs from the University of Krakow, and the other speaker is Idit from the Open University of Israel. I urge the people who want to come, please come in if you want, because we are starting our session. And I would like to invite Jolanta Ambrosewicz-Jacobs to give the first talk. She is a PhD lecturer in the UNESCO Chair for Education about the Holocaust. She was director of the Center for Holocaust Studies at the Colloquium University and hold a PhD of Humanities from this university. She's been also a postdoc in various places. So please, Jolanta, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you very much for my introduction. Just very small correction. I just have one Jewish name, Jacobs, and not Abramowicz, but Ambrosewicz, which is non-Jewish. One Jewish, one non-Jewish name.
That's Jacob.
Okay, not two. All right. So I decided to bring some topic which is quite relevant but very long-lasting. And of course, thinking about the quote to sort of inspire me for this presentation. Of course, Bauman, who spoke so many times about the remembrance as interpretation of the past. But also I found Janusz Korczak, and I would really like to dedicate this quote to contemporary educational policymakers in Poland, in other countries. Janusz Korczak wrote, "Who escapes history will be reached by history." And I think this is the process going on in my country. And I try to categorize the imagined Jewish past in Poland by Poles and also by Jews, but it's not symmetrical, I found. Definitely, we face overemphasizing hospitality. We create memory, history, and myths are interconnected. They're very close to each other, those categories. There's enormous literature. I'm not going to cover or even mention theories, but definitely in a Polish historical narrative, there is a diminishing pogroms, I would say. Pogroms are, but definitely downplayed. There is a myth of guests. So I would like to quote Jakub Wexler Waszkinel in Lublin. I've heard him many years ago, I believe 15 years ago, at the Grodzka Gate Theater NN. And then at the conference with the Archbishop Życiński and Father Dezelars, Father Manfred from Oświęcim, and other representatives of church, he asked, sort of responding to the voice of older gentlemen from the audience who said, "But we were so hospitable to Jews," etc. This sort of beginning of this narrative. He said, "Whose family was first here? Yours, maybe mine." So this is a very good question. Who was actually, this is the myth of we Poles invited Jews, right? But maybe some ethnic Polish families came to Polish land much later than ancestors of many Jews. So another myth of innocence. This is we Poles, we Poles. So I'm going to really generalize. When I say we Poles, that doesn't mean all of us. That doesn't mean like Professor Mach and me, and many others. Okay, but I have to use some categories. All right. So let's say that some segments of Polish national group really are linked to this myth of innocence, and then I'm trying to explore why later on. There are definitely many distortions in representation of the righteous because the context is omitted. And even in leading NGOs in Poland who really implement wonderful projects, this is a bit taboo project. I promise I'm going to talk about taboo topics. So this is one of them. This is like the context is like using code. Even in Bodzentyn, Mrs. Jadwiga Płonka talking about the righteous, their parents, who really were shelter a Jewish friend through whole war. After the end of the war, she said she used this language code, linguistic code, and then they let him go before the day started, when it was dark, because everybody knew how was it. This is the code. And without explication, everybody knew. There were Swedish educators, Polish educators, no one asked questions. This is like questions never asked, right? Because everybody knew how was it. So, of course, competition of suffering during World War II, as present in empirical studies, Krzemiński and his team, Małgorzata Melchior, Zdzisław Mach, in my empirical studies, it's all the time present. We can, of course, discuss about, like yesterday, very, very, very right comments of Professor Poloński and many others about this, how to ask who suffered more. This is a very not good question, but this competition of suffering is very present. Then, question mark, actually I'm asking myself whether we have this martyrological competition of Holocaust Gulag. And then simulacrum and myth of life in Kazimierz. And actually foreign students notice this. This is the simulacrum, it's a category of Jean Baudrillard. Not everybody likes Kazimierz. Not everybody likes Kazimierz. It's like the Holocaust is missing there. This is like, let's be happy, right? Eat Jewish food or supposedly Jewish food, etc. And I had a Canadian student of Polish origin who wrote, student of philosophy, who wrote excellent thesis on simulacrum in Kazimierz. Excellent, very critical. Very critical. So I'm learning from my students as well, because they're foreign students. They see a bit differently my country. Okay, so this is not symmetrical. When I was trying to think about imagined Jewish past in Poland by Jews, this is a very good quote of Professor Jonathan Weber. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this quote. Demonized view of an anti-Semitic Poland. It is present. There is another taboo topic, which I would like maybe explore a bit later. The behavior or misbehavior of some Israeli groups or Jewish groups in Poland, but mostly Israeli. It's very important because it contributes to race of anti-Semitism in Poland, and it's not acknowledged enough. I'm going to discuss it based on a case study, recent case study of my colleague, who is a guide, one of the top guides in Poland, Dr. Tomasz Cebulski. He put a post on Facebook, so it's public. It's very important. He got support from many Israeli educators and guides. He started this post with saying, enough is enough. Okay, so I would like to summarize my presentation, so we have enough time for discussion. There is, of course, we know that the history and culture of Polish Jews, or Jews of Poland, I would say, was unknown, forgotten, distorted for generations of Poles after the war. And then there was like, I would say, a green light, increase of interest in facing the darkest pages of Polish history. Not after 89, the fall of communism, but more after 2000, after debate on Jedwabne. But after 2015, there is tendency to reverse this trend or confrontational trend. And the conflicts of memories are numerous. For example, I just give examples between official state ideology and local communities. Like for a very good example, very well known to you, planting crosses near Auschwitz site, right? They were removed by army overnight. So not to sort of confront local community planting those crosses. So there was a conflict between the state and the people, I would say, right? There are conflicts within local communities. Tadeusz Markiel in Gniewczyna, that's I will show you the cover of the book. And JCC versus March of the Living. It's not a conflict. I would say it's a confrontation. It's a bit even humorous. Okay? So those conflicts around Auschwitz-Birkenau site, they're not very loud, but they still exist. And I would say that many inhabitants of Oświęcim, not all, of course, they have a sort of lack of understanding, lack of consciousness that Auschwitz is the biggest Jewish cemetery in the world, because it's the biggest Polish cemetery in the world as well. So they're competing memories. This is a battleground of memories at Auschwitz all the time. And then I did some empirical studies in a village, Piotrowice, near Oświęcim, and then actually the students from primary school, at that time they were 14 years old, they revealed the highest level of anti-Semitism. Near Piotrowice, it's a village close to Auschwitz. How is it possible to deny the Holocaust? Almost saying Auschwitz, because of those conflicts, because they've heard in their families that Jews are sort of doing something on our land, because Auschwitz also belongs to us, and all these stories, all these family narratives had impact on their attitudes, which resulted in secondary anti-Semitism, which is very well described in Germany, but also in Poland, phenomenon, which has a lot of common with education about the Holocaust and the Holocaust fatigue. And this has to be addressed, and I think it's not addressed in education in Poland. So I'm conducting empirical studies because I don't like this mantra of education. I want to know what works, what doesn't work, and why. So Tadeusz Markiel, I don't know, this book wasn't translated into English. He was a boy who witnessed in Gniewczyna, in his little town, massacres of Jews by local Polish inhabitants of Gniewczyna, and he just kept it with him for many, many years. And then with Alina Skibiska, the great historian, they worked together to publish the book, which revealed those the darkest pages of local history. So of course he was ostracized and treated in not a pleasant way, but his daughter hopefully will carry on his message. And he died soon afterwards, after publishing this book. So some old people are not afraid to face it, and some young people. So the problem is with the middle ages generations. And this confrontation, hey, March of the Living, come inside and see some Jewish life with the bigger letters, right? It's not a conflict, that's confrontation. This is confrontation because it's not fair also for Polish Jews to be treated that way, right? So this is like conflict, it's like a metaphor. I'm talking about various, maybe, I don't know how to say, lack of empathy or understanding, right? Okay, I do agree with Professor Sułek from Warsaw, who thinks that Jews are perceived as a threat to Polish national identity. That corresponds with the lecture of Zdzisław Mach at the beginning of our symposium. And it's blocked by many variables, very strong feeling, awareness, memory of own suffering, and also lack of recognition of Polish ethnic suffering by the world, by the outside world. And there is a gap, growing up gap, and after new reform, just when I was on a train, the reform was signed, so it's a bill now, which will evoke enormous protests all over Poland, announced already in the second half of March. So new historiography, it's very interesting. It doesn't evoke hostility as Jan Tomasz Gross books, right? They're great historians and ethnographer, Joanna Tokarska-Bakir. They write excellent books based on documents. There's no debates about it, no denial. It's a very interesting phenomenon in Poland. And Jan Tomasz Gross is like a symbol, actually, a symbol. So I think the false identity is attributed to him, right? That he's a Jew, a foreign, the other, which is not the fact, right? Because his mother was ethnically Polish. The father was Jewish. So the taboo topic in Poland, another one, is the third wave of the Holocaust and the sort of disappearance of 200,000 Jews. We have not enough studies, and we don't know whether we ever find out what happened to them, whether they were denounced or they died from hunger or they were killed by Poles. But definitely this is the phase where Poles who do have to confront. Although I talked recently to Professor Dieter Paul in Vienna, and he said, but this wasn't collaboration. He didn't like this term, talking about the involvement of Poles in the last wave of the Holocaust, using this term collaboration. Yes, it's different from what was going on in Baltic countries, in Hungary, in Ukraine. It's definitely, but how to call it? This is my question. Maybe you have some ideas how to call it. And then we have many educational challenges related, of course, to this discrepancy. And then Robert Schuchter and me, we wrote about it on the basis of very careful analysis done by Robert, the analysis of knowledge about this society textbooks, new textbooks, which are already old, because new reform attempts to rewrite, of course, Polish history, Polish textbooks, Polish curriculum. The curricular framework was already published. What I've heard on TV, what some experts said, that it moves Poland backwards 50 years, half of century. So it's a very serious problem, and I think it's not acknowledged enough in the world, and particularly but some important institutions dealing with education about the Holocaust. Because then, of course, Poland is very isolated in this way that we struggle against this reform, parents, teachers, those responsible for implementation of this reform. But I think there are voices, of course, of critics of anti-defamation law, recent anti-defamation law, but it's not enough. Non-governmental institutions, civil society, this is where I also work. I'm a regular scholar at the university, but I also co-organize teacher trainings with Yad Vashem and with other institutions for 13 years. Very grateful for this cooperation. So the empirical studies, those are my studies. Responses to the question, is the memory of the Holocaust important for you, and even personally important to you? You can see significant statistical differences between blue bar responses from students from classes taught by teachers who wanted to really teach them. There were voices that teachers, we have to work with teachers. It's up to teachers in Israel, in Poland. Yes, there is mandatory education about the Holocaust, and teacher can say 2 phrases and they can teach several hours, at least in Poland. In Israel, it's a totally different situation. So education works, but then quality education depends what is done, what is the content of this education, and format, of course, as well. So I have hard data that it works, but we cannot say that only education. Teachers who do something else, who show testimonies, who take students to memorial sites, those who use drama, for example, who really work on historical documents, who provide experiential teaching. As yesterday, Dr. Kubishin presented projects from Majdanek. So that's what works. And it's empirically proven. So if you want to, I don't know, to have arguments to get grants for extracurricular projects, there are some data. Yes, unfortunately, Jedwabne disappears from Polish textbooks, and I again agree with Professor Sułek that actually those debates, events, they not only didn't enter memory, but they actually evaporate due to education. I don't want to elaborate too much on numbers because I really want to discuss with you those statements, so I'm really summarizing. I also said yesterday that I will refer to Michał Bilewicz. It's a different publication of Marta Witkowska and Michał Bilewicz, but what I highlighted in red, that confrontation with historical truth is not effective. And this is according to their studies, which are very well documented, and the level of ignorance is growing. And this is, I think it also corresponds with Zdzisław Mach's statement that identity is so crucial. If education threatens identity, it's not effective. It has a counter, actually effective result. So because fictions help to live, we avoid cognitive dissonance this way. So denial is helps us to actually dissolve those conflicts. Otherwise, we have a serious conflicts that we, as a group, such a big group as nation, we are not always great heroes or martyrs, because we were not. But how to integrate it? This is a big question for education, for educators. So there are initiatives which are absolutely great initiatives. March of Memory of Krakow, Zbigniew Ryba from middle school. He marches from the former ghetto to Płaszów memorial site and the former camp with Polish flag. And this is a very, very good, strong message. The Krakowian Jews were Polish citizens. So their fate matters to us. This is what's missing in education about the Holocaust, which absolutely, I agree with Michał Bilewicz, is taught like something happened to them, not to Polish citizens as well. So Poles think in ethnic, not civic categories. So many years after the fall of communism, but now communism is almost back. Then reflection. We need time for reflection. Definitely. This is the on the right side, students of Robert Schuchta in Tykocin. He was nearby, ready to answer questions, but he left them alone. And this is when they were interviewed in our studies. This is what they value, that there was no hurry up, just like tick, that this was done. Even if you don't pass a lot of knowledge, it's better not to really expose them to many facts, but just less, it's more meaningful. And that's what they say. One student interview for my empirical studies, he said, "This I will always remember." And of course, I always show Grodzka Gate Theater, and then it will be presented, but I just have to. And Henio Żytomierski, because I want to, this is the project, which of course we talk about influences, but I think many Grodzka Gate Theater NN projects are very original because they're rooted in Polish underground alternative theater. So I think it's Tomasz Pietrasiewicz and his team, it's really very creative. But almost in every Polish town or village or city, there was a Henio Żytomierski, a Jewish boy from assimilated family, and it's very easy and very strong. And and quite simple educational projects. You don't need a lot of money for this. Okay, the project of new legislation, very, very controversial, and protection of the good name of Poland. It's, of course, it's a legal case, and I do agree that this law does not make sense, because in Poland there is almost not the Auschwitz denial. It's not existing. No, Poles will not deny Auschwitz. So it is aimed at Polish concentration camps phrase. But this law will not reach foreign journalists, because Polish law courts cannot reach foreign countries. So why to implement law which cannot be really executed? This is a very big question, right? All right, the Polish Center of Holocaust Research, which I value enormously, of course, issued a protest, which is very well written. It's on the web. And what they think about the idea to criminalize debates about the past with the threat to participants and even jail terms. This is, I quote, brings to mind the worst periods of red and brown totalitarianism. It's very, very strong, but so right. And I want to conclude with Maria Janion. She wrote also very strong words, that we will never be purified. The Holocaust will remain a mourning without end. But the chance is not lost. It's worth to talk to young people. There was no mourning of Polish Jews in Poland, as in many other countries, as in Germany for decades, till 60s almost. So it's worth to talk to young people. How we can talk? Through educators, through teachers, Orit, Jan Tomasz Gross, Tomasz Toiwiblat is not around us, Robert Kuwak is not around us, but there are 600 at least graduate Polish teachers, and they carry on this really meaningful education. Priests, church, we need more involvement of local priests. This is a case from Bodzentyn. Local priest, Dr. Leszek Sikorski, he called to clean a local Jewish cemetery. And inhabitants, they responded positively. There was a Swedish committee against anti-Semitism, founded the gate. So the education can start with no funds, almost, just with the goodwill to clean local Polish cemetery. There are 1,200 cemeteries left. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk, Jolanta. And I'm sure we have a lot of questions. We will postpone it to the question session. Let me invite Idit Gil to give her talk on this session. Idit, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for the organizer for inviting me. My main research is about Jewish forced laborers throughout the war. What was the Nazi labor policy, how it was changed, and how the Jews reacted to this policy. So it's nothing related to this topic. I also just finished a project, a book that is going to be published in the very soon, which combines my father's memories with research that I did about his experiences. So basically, the place I chose for this talk is his place. And then in the past, I did some research about Israel and the Holocaust. So the periodization I'm taking for this talk is based on the periodization I did for the collective memory of the Holocaust in Israel. So I combined it for this talk. And since my title is very general, I decided to talk about a specific shtetl, which will be a case study of Jewish shtetls, and through this I can view how the Israeli discourse about Jewish life in Poland in small shtetls have been changed throughout the years. And I chose the town of Pshitik, which had with the pogrom that took place in 1936. So I'm going to talk about the Pshitik pogrom and about the song that was written was written following this pogrom in 1938 as Brent, our town is burning, the very famous song, and to see how it was changed in the Israeli discourse. And I will mainly talk about how it was seen in Israeli newspapers, again, because of shortage of time. A short background about the pogrom. Actually, in Pshitik, a town in central Poland, about 90% of the inhabitants were the Jews. They were merchants and artisans. And on March 9, 1936, during the weekly market, a pogrom took place in town. And the Jewish Telegraphic Agency published the following report about the pogrom. This town today resembled a besieged city during wartime, after 700 Jewish families had yesterday undergone a pogrom reminiscent of Tsarist days in Russia in its brutality and careful preparation. Now, the pogrom created the trepidation in the Jewish world. Polish Jews held a month of mourning, no weddings, no theater plays. They had a general strike, but not only in Poland, in Saloniki, in New York, Buenos Aires, and even in Tel Aviv. There were demonstrations in support of Polish Jews. In Tel Aviv, there was one rally at Bet Ha'am of thousands of people who supported Polish Jews and protested the Polish authorities. A few days later, revisionists came to the Polish consulate in Tel Aviv, threw stones and took out all the signs in Polish. And the question is basically why this pogrom caused such trepidation in the Jewish world. It was not the first pogrom in Poland after its independence in 1918. It was not the last one, not the deadly one. And my answer is basically that this pogrom had two aspects which made him the most notorious pogrom between the wars. And these are, one is the Jewish defense, and the other one is the Polish authorities' response to the pogrom and to Jewish grievances. So Jewish defense actually was comprised of two aspects. One was Jews acted spontaneously. They used sticks, they used metal tools, they used stones to attack the Poles. One of the defendants there was a 68-year-old man who was accused of hurting a Pole only with sticks. And then there was an armed resistance. From late 1935, Jews from all political spectrum, all youth, organized defense. They cooperated with the Socialist Party. The Socialists bought them pistols, and the Jews trained in the nearby woods. The police claimed that during the pogrom, the Jews fired 80 shots. They killed one Pole and wounded 3. And after the pogrom, there was a trial for 16 Jews, 43 Poles, it actually became a political trial, which was published all over the world. Journalists from around the world came to see the trial. A book which was published shortly after the trial was titled The Great Trial of the Poles Against the Jews. And the court concurred with the prosecution. The Jews started the riots, and all the Jews were actually received prison terms. Not all the Poles received prison terms, and the Jews believed that the government intervened in the verdict, and so the Jews were not happy with it, actually, and the Polish authorities continued after the trial to support anti-Jewish activities. For example, the famous economic ban against the Jews was officially supported. There were other violence acts. When people were caught, they were immediately released from courts. So the Jews basically found themselves between the rock and a hard place. They didn't have what to do. And I believe that this is basically the background for Gebirtig writing the song Es brennt, Our Town is Burning, because he wrote it 2 years after the pogrom. And he explicitly said that the song was written, it was inspired by the pogrom. Now, when I'm looking at the pogrom and the song, how do I turn it? How do I? Let's see. Okay, I jumped one slide. Okay, actually, when I'm talking about the pogrom, I look at 3 different aspects. One is the pogrom itself, the violence that include the attackers, and the other thing is the authorities' response. Today we will say for all these are Polish-Jewish relations, but we can see that it was differentiated in the newspapers. The other aspect when I'm looking about the pogrom is the Jewish defense, and the third aspect is, of course, the Jewish community, the shtetl. So first, let us look at what the newspapers wrote in 1936, when just after the pogrom. And indeed, the newspapers wrote extensively about the violence. They described both what the attackers did, and they described what the authorities' response was. Actually, they even described what the authorities did not do before the pogrom, because the Jews complained that there were increasing attacks, they wanted protection, but the local authorities responded, as long as there aren't any causalities, there is no reason to intervene. So, of course, the violence was widely described in these newspapers. The question is about the Jewish defense. This is an interesting issue because it contradicts the Zionist view about life of Jews in the diaspora. The Zionist ideology tried to distance itself from Jews in the diaspora. They wanted to create a new Jew, and diaspora Jews were seen as passive, as waiting for redemption, praying for miracles, ingratiating towards the authorities, submissively accepting their fate. They were portrayed as miserable persons living in economic and social distress, very religious, which was a characteristic of a non-modern world. And in this way, were conducting an unfulfilling life. And nevertheless, the newspapers did describe some of the defense, and we should look at one example how they did it. This is from the newspaper Doar Hayom, and the newspaper wrote, "Most of Pshitic Jews belong to the old generation, yet even in this community, one could find fearless Jews who saved the Jews from a total disaster." So even in this community, the word even showed that the defense was exceptional. The defense was worthy of admiration, but it was in contradiction with what was expected. Now, despite this contradiction, the shtetl itself was described in positive words. The Jewish community was described in a very positive words. It existed for 500 years. Its residents were productive. They were industrialists and merchants. The change in the Yishuv, the pre-state approach for Jewish defense, took place during the Holocaust. In 1940 and in 1941, we can still find newspapers who wrote positively and hailed the defense of those Jews in Pshitik. They argued that the Jews were jailed just because they defended themselves. Yet after 1941, no mention of the defense in the public discourse. Now, throughout the war, newspapers mentioned the pogrom. Mostly it was mentioned in the context of cooperation between Polish nationalists and Nazis. Very often, the same index who attacked during the pogrom cooperated with the Nazis. And I could even find in January 1948 in Davar that they wrote that some of those who attacked in the Pshitik pogrom later cooperated with the Nazis, and in the 40s came and trained the Arabs against the Israel. So this is Matzah minet mino, find a feather flock together. During the 1950s, the pogrom was still very high on the agenda of the Israeli newspapers. Actually, the word Pshitik was synonymous with a pogrom. There was no need even to explain what was the pogrom about, what is the historical context. Sometimes there is only the word Pshitik, and the readers knew what it was meant. I will give two examples. One was an article which was titled Costa Rica and the Jewish Problem. It was about Jews in Costa Rica. And then they had the author wrote this sentence. As I left the airplane, I smelled the whiff of pshitik. In Hebrew, כשנחתתי, ריח של פשיטיק עלה באפי. Now, I don't know what is a pshitik smell, what is a town smell. A few sentences later, it says, when I drove in the streets, I saw signs, Jews leave our country. But apparently, those who read it in the 50s knew what is this smell. Another example is from a critique about the play Hadibuk. It was played in Abima, the 500 play, and the critique wrote that about the scenery on the stage, it is a world of pshitik. So here it's probably the shtetl, the backward shtetl, and we see in the newspapers when they describe pshitik, they do describe it as a helpless, unproductive town, reflecting the image of the shtetl that we know that was seen in Israel at that time. Now, in that time, also the period acquired another interesting aspect, and it was actually been promoted to represent Polish pogroms. The pogrom was seen as one of the pogroms that inflicted upon the Jewish people. It was in correspondence, I can say, with the view of the Holocaust at that time. Ben Zion Dinur, who was a Jewish professor, was the education minister, was the first chairman of Yad Vashem, believed that the Holocaust was one pogrom among others. So very often when newspapers describe the pogroms that were inflicted about the Jewish people, it was the Pshitik pogrom was among them, especially during holidays. One on Purim, for example, between the persecution described in the scroll of Esther's and those of Majdanek, there was this Pshitik pogrom, and actually the drawing here was in this article about the Purim. You can see that the earrings are Hamantaschen, so it's Purim, and you can see the various countries, and Poland is near the Nazi symbol. Of course, the man, I don't know, here is a very anti-Semitic view of the anti-Semitic would use to portray Jews, and here it's they portray the anti-Semitic. And in Passover, we can see the same between Pharaoh, and then we have Kishinev, and then we have Pshitik pogrom, and then Hitler. In this decade also, some academics who started to write about the Holocaust also pay attention to the pogroms in Poland. And one of them was the sociologist Jakub Liszański, who wrote extensively about pogroms and especially about the Pshitik pogrom. And he argued that we can understand why the Holocaust, why the extermination centers were in Poland when we look at these pogroms. So it was debated at this time, but it was all changed basically after the Eichmann trial. After the Eichmann trial, the pogrom, the Pshitik pogrom, has disappeared from the public discourse. In the 1950s, the Holocaust was basically seen as an intimidation. Its memory was seen that the Holocaust was an intimidation, but the Eichmann trial actually shifted the view, and the focus was now on extermination and on the Nazis as the main perpetrators. And so the whole view of the Holocaust was changed, and with it actually the role of the Poles kind of disappeared from the public discourse, including the Pshitik pogrom. Since then, basically there is hardly any mention of this pogrom in Israeli newspapers, and I will return to it, what happened today later, but I now want to go now to the song that, as I said, was written in 1938 following the pogrom. At that time, the Polish authorities did not allow to sing it, but in the ghetto, in Krakow ghetto where Gebirtig was, it was sung by the fighters. Gebirtig transferred the song to other people, and after the war, it was first published in a small brochure with 14 songs that the Krakow Jewish Committee published. I read it 1945, but we can see here it was 1946. And all the songs except one were written during the Holocaust, but the title of the book was Es brennt. So basically the song became associated with the Holocaust. And during the 1940s and 50s, the song was quoted rather with the pogrom, not with the defense, but it was mentioned that it was was written after the pogrom, or with the Krakow fighters. It was not yet translated officially to Hebrew. There were translation parts of it in the newspapers. So basically, one of the translations is, for example, show your strength, don't stand with your hands folded. And it was seen then as a call for a reaction, and Gebirtig was seen actually as a troubadour of the ghetto, a hero who foresaw what is the Holocaust. But I would like to emphasize that it was seen, again, in a positive way, as a call to revolt, a call to rebel, okay? So this was actually in the 1950s, but then in 1967, the song was published in a book in Hebrew. Again, it was Mordechai Gebirtig Songs. Again, the name was, the title was that of the song. And here, actually, the song lost first its connection to the Pshitik pogrom and to its original meaning. The chorus was, and you stand there looking on with futile folded arms, and you stand there looking on while our village burns. So the song was now sung with the partisans' hymn. It was sung before with the partisans' hymns, but before they were kind of complementing each other. One was calling for rebel, and one was the actual rebellion. Now it was seen as, according to the Zionist view, who, like, the Jews went like lamb to the slaughter, like sheep to the slaughter, then the Es brennt was seen as the Jews going like sheep to the slaughter because they were standing with their arms folded, and the partisan song was seen as the real rebellion. But of course, as we know what the events were, it doesn't fit, it doesn't correspond with where the events were. And the song was actually was sung in Holocaust Memorial Days until the 1980s, and then it kind of not disappeared totally, but it was not as famous. It returned back only in the last decade and a half, and here, as we know, more of a disco style, and the Holocaust itself, since the 80s, received the meaning of a catastrophe. The Holocaust was seen as a catastrophe. Everything is a Holocaust. There is a climate Holocaust. Everything becomes a Holocaust. So every Holocaust can be looked as the town is burning. There was in the Carmel. There was a fire in the Carmel. So there was singers who sang the song with the views of the fire. There is a political activist who doesn't like what's going on in Gaza, so he sings the songs about the Palestinians. So the song actually these days received a very different connotation. About the pogrom, actually about the shtetl, there is kind of a return to the shtetl. This is for a book by Gideon Ofrat. The shtetl became an image of all Jews. With multiculturalism, there is more positive view of the shtetl. Painters paint the shtetl in a more positive view. And there is a return of pogroms that were taken in Poland, the Jedwabne and the Kielce pogrom. Again, competition who suffered more or who is more of a victim. So there is a debate about the pogroms, but not about the Pshitik pogrom. The Pshitik pogrom did not basically return to the public sphere. There is one MA thesis in Israel about the pogrom. In the US, there was an article about it, and the Polin gave a whole section with various articles about the pogrom, but in Israel, nothing. Last year, it was the 80 years of the pogrom. I couldn't find anything in Hebrew, not even in historical sites who commemorated. There was one article only in the English edition of Haaretz, not in the Hebrew one, only in the English one about the Pshitik pogrom. I must say, I went quickly through the exhibition here. I didn't find the pogrom here, although, as I said, it was such a notorious one. So one can say that metaphorically, the Pshitik shtetl and its defense actions during the pogrom were completely burned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I invite the two participants to come here. I'm sure there's a lot of comments, and we have about 10 minutes, so please.
I very much liked Idit presentation, but of course there is a large historiography on Pshitik. Piotr Gontarczyk wrote a rather firstly, Jolanta Zindel, who was here yesterday, wrote a very important study of anti-Jewish violence 1936 to 38, in which Pshitik is discussed. Unfortunately, she's not here today. Piotr Gontarczyk wrote a whole study of the Pshitik pogrom, which was a rather tendentious study. It was reviewed in Gazeta Wyborcza. We published, as you correctly point out, the article reviewing the book by Jolanta Zindel and Piotr Gontarczyk's response. I also published in Polin the transcripts of the court case and, in addition, the verdict of the court case. And it's certainly something that is very much in Polish public discourse, and actually we do describe in the museum the wave of anti-Jewish violence. So that's there too. So this is definitely not something that has disappeared from public discourse here, and it's certainly seen as part of the worsening of the Jewish situation after 1935. Having said that, I'd like to say something about what the material shows, which I think also is important. Self-defense is a wonderful thing. And Bialik complained that there had been no self-defense in Chisinau. Of course, there had been some. But the problem with self-defense is when you put guns in the hands of people, and there was a resistance movement in Pshitik, organized and is described in Joshua Rottenberg, who's in his article in Soviet Jewish Affairs, he participated in it. When you have people with guns, and when you have violence, people tend to shoot these guns off. And what happened in Pshitik, I'm not defending what happened, it was a terrible event. What was happening was there was a boycott where there was inadequate police and a certain amount of violence was taking place, but no casualties of a mortal type took place. At a particular moment during this, as the violence began to explode, one of the members of the Jewish resistance fired a shot, and he killed somebody, a man called Chilevich. Now, as a South African, this often is a feature of race riots. I don't like the term pogrom. It's a term which doesn't really have much scholarly meaning. We're talking here about a race riot. And this was a classic race riot, and often the weaker party in these race riots starts by trying to defend itself, and this is what leads to the explosion. That's what happened in Pshitik. What happened in Pshitik was that the Jewish self-defense, trying to defend itself, used mortal force, and this then led to the explosion. This doesn't make it any better or any worse. I mean, it just describes what happens. But I think that we know a great deal about what happened in Pshitik, and it's an interesting example of the barriers which somehow have arisen, that this doesn't seem to have penetrated to Israeli public discourse, whereas it's very well established in Polish discourse. And I think in general history, I mean, I published all this material. It's distressing to me that this is something that I'd like to deal with in relation to Jolanta. You know, we spend our whole lives writing this stuff. It doesn't seem to make any difference to what happens. So I'll stop at that point.
I read quite a lot about the events, what happened exactly at what time and who pushed whom, and it was actually started when the goalkeeper among the Jews did not allow to attack a Polish woman who bought a roll from the baker, and I know the whole debate, and as I agree, but it's very interesting that in Israel it disappeared. I mean, it was until the end of the 1950s. It was well known, but then it completely disappears and doesn't.
Yes, Moti, and then Israel.
Idit, I was listening very carefully. Following what Anthony said, I think we should be very careful using the term pogrom. And what was missing for me was the theoretical perspective. I just turn your attention to two, or mainly, well, actually more works which were published during the last recent years discussing the very term pogrom. There's an article published in Hebrew by Professor Gura Lori of the University of Haifa, and a very important book by Professor Darius Talunas of Vilnius in a book in English named An Enemy of a Day, discussing thoroughly what does it mean, a pogrom. When a non-Jew threw a stone on a Jewish window, is it a pogrom? Or do we use any other criteria? So what I mean, we should be very careful, and I totally agree with Anthony. In this case, in Pshitik, we should review carefully the order of the events. And from my point of view, the moment Jews hold weapons and fired, from that moment, it became sort of, I would say, a battlefield in between Jews and non-Jews. I'm not saying now a word about the response of the authorities, or, I mean, they did not respond from the Jews' point of view correctly. But Again, we should be very, very careful regarding using the term pogrom. And to Jolanta, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. As I told you yesterday, when I read your former book, Me, Us, and which I highly recommend to everybody, and this presentation was sort of a continuation, and I really appreciated it. Thank you.
My topic was not basically the pogrom or the violent actions that were taken at that time. That's why I didn't elaborate about it. My topic was about the memory of the shtetl of Polish-Jewish relations in today. I use the word pogrom because this is the way it is, and what we don't actually argue about the facts. We argue whether it was a pogrom or not. Okay, I read the theoretical views, what is a pogrom and what is not, and I know there is these arguments, but we can agree that there were violent acts against the Jews. The Jews fired, defended themselves, and the question, and at that time, as I said, it was so famous all over the world. It made such trepidation. So I wonder what happened with this event today in the Israeli public sphere. And I didn't mention the books, although I read what happened with the books, with the second and third grades, where they studied about, for example, the song. So it does have any meaning to see how Israelis see Jewish-Polish relations in Israel throughout the years. That was my point.
I just wanted to thank you very much for your comment.
Okay, Israel.
If one talks of the Israeli images of Eastern European anti-Jewish violence, I'm deliberately not using the word pogrom. First of all, I would like to mention a fourth book published in English a couple of years ago. I was one of the editors, Anti-Jewish Violence in Eastern Europe, where you have a wonderful article by David Engel, What Takes a Pogrom, which actually discusses this. But mainly, I think that your presentation of the Israeli collective memory as related to violence, inter-ethnic violence in Eastern Europe in general, in Poland in particular, lacks a much broader background. First of all, it is ambiguous. It was neither positive or negative, because you mentioned Ben Zion Dinu, for example. Have in mind that Ben Zion Dinu, who was this historian of Eastern Europe and also the Minister of Education in Israel, was also the chief editor of Sefer HaHaganah, the Book of Defense. Actually, in the Zionist labor mind and in the revisionist mind, self-defense in pogroms was the major source of Israeli, if you like, defense corps. And everything you said here actually should be taken back to the pogroms of 1881, 1882, where in most of them there was self-defense, not totally, forgotten totally in Israeli collective memory. Then, of course, the 1903, 1905 things, and everything that was said in the 30s about Pshitig actually rang a bell. But the most important issue is, of course, the issue of why people remember a pogrom where one person was killed and do not remember a pogrom when in one night more than 2,000 people were killed. In 1919, around 150,000 Jews were massacred all over Ukraine. Okay, there were anti-Jewish Polish pogroms, if you remember, of course, in 1919. They are totally forgotten in today's Israeli collective memory. So the question sounds like kind of banal in many ways, because actually memory takes what we call politicized memory. And actually everything should be compared in terms of what was important at that moment for media, for politicians, and for all people who kind of have an impact on future collective memory.
First, excuse me, I'd like to thank Jolanta for a very interesting talk. And I have a question about the Pshitik pogrom. A few months after the Pshitik pogrom, you had a pogrom in Minsk Mazowiecki. And the reaction, the Jewish reaction in this pogrom became extremely controversial because practically the entire Jewish community, including the rabbi, ran to Warsaw. There was just a mass flight, no attempt at resistance. The conduct of the town rabbi, Kaplan, caused a lot of anger and criticism. I'm wondering how that was reported and remembered in the press of the Yeshuv at the time, whether there was any attempt to compare Pshitik and Minsk Mazowiecki.
I remember I read about the Minsk Mazowiecki disturbances, about the flight. I don't recall if I read it in the Zionist newspapers or rather the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, but the Minsk Mazowiecki disturbances were actually mentioned later when they mentioned in the 40s or even the late 30s. When they mentioned the pogroms in Poland, they said Pshitik, Minsk, there was another one. So it was, they didn't compare between them. It was, the Minsk and Pshitik were two pogroms in a series of pogroms in Poland. But I didn't see any specific note about the pogrom or about the fact that those Jews defended themselves and the other just beforehand flew from town.
Any further comment or question?
Yes. Firstly, the Osias Thorn, just before he died, commented favorably on what happened in Pshitik and said this has now diminished violence. And certainly after Pshitik, the wave of violence, this is clearly described in Jolanta Zindel's book, subsided somewhat. Minsk Mazowiecki was the last of such events. It was partly because of the that people now feared there might be violence against themselves. But I think also the government worried about this. And one of the problems in Pshitik, this is shown clearly in the material which I published in English, but was available in Polish as well, that there was inadequate policing in Minsk, in Pshitik. This is another case about pogroms or anti-Jewish violence in the 19th century. They often erupted because the Russian government didn't have an adequate police force, used army to maintain order. I'd just like to make two other points. First is, one of the people who defended the Jews who were put on trial after the Pshitik pogrom was a very well-known non-Jewish civil rights lawyer, Václav Szymański, Jan Gross's grandfather. So there is an odd connection here between Pshitik and Jedwabne. And this is an aspect of Jan Gross which has got lost, as Jolanta pointed out, when Gross, the Jew attacking Poland. On his mother's side, he came from a very distinguished family of Polish, non-Jewish civil rights lawyers. But I just underline this. I'd like to say something. I also very much valued Jolanta's fine presentation. When we say that the self-critical historiography, which has developed since the mid-1980s, doesn't affect students, this is true, but what isn't true is the fact that it does affect educators. It affects Jolanta and it affects me and it affects everybody in this room. And we are the people who are actually teaching the students. So the impact of this is indirect rather than direct. But I don't think we should be wholly pessimistic about the impact of the historiography of the self-critical historiography of the last 25 years. And here, I'd also like to speculate on the question of why the work which is done by the Centrum Badań nad Zagłada Żydów, from Grabowski to Engelking, Petelevich, and so on, does not evoke the same violent reaction as Gross. And that is because whatever you can say about Jan Gross, I mean, I don't believe that there's any difference between sociologists and historians, but Jan is a great polemicist. His grandfather, Adolf Gross, as I said yesterday, was described as the finest speaker in the Austrian parliament. This is somebody who writes polemics. He writes things which shock people, and he writes to shock people. Whether this is good or bad, I don't know, but, you know, I've written 2,000 pages on Polish Jewish history, nobody notices. When Gross writes 2 pages, everybody notices. And that is, this is one of the odd aspects about historical controversy. Henry Kissinger said, it's easy to see why they fight so bitterly, the stakes are so low. The stakes are not so low, but academic controversy requires both careful, measured discussion, listening to your opponents. I had a lot of trouble publishing Gontarczyk. I won't go into how he reacted to the Jindal article, threatened to sue me before we reached agreement. But I felt it was good to have both sides. I wanted to have, but you need both the person who provokes and the person who does detailed historical research. And the second doesn't provoke the same violence, but it's what really lasts. Gross is the inspiration for the work of the Centrum Badania Zagłady Żydów.
Yes, thank you very much for your comment, Anthony. This was exactly what I wanted to actually follow up in this direction. Well, but also, yes, exactly. But also students, or at least American students, repeat mistakes which Jan Tomasz Gross made, right? 1,600, it's a magical number. Who reads Andrzej Żbikowski, right? Or the 2 volumes Wokół Jedwabnego. And yes, and that's, the numbers are different. This is the problem. Yes, I wanted to say the style, right? Piotr Wróbel, writing review of The Neighbor, said, I wish I could write such books, right? This is almost exactly the quote. But I also wanted to say something more. This discrepancy exists between education and historiography, not necessarily educators and historiography. That's the first thing. And the second point is that education affects public memory, definitely, right? This is the sort of the content. It's a very big topic, a big subject, how knowledge is transferred into the students' minds, etc. The fact is that Jedwabne disappears. Students do not know because there is an elite of educators. There's, let's say, between 1,200, 2,000, maybe 3,000 of Polish teachers, educators, who are very devoted to teach about the Holocaust, who believe that memory of the Holocaust, it's important for us, Poles, non-Jews. But they're not all teachers, just like fraction, right? It's a part of society. So this is my problem as an educator, educating students. Students do not know about Jedwabne. University students, they come with lack of this knowledge from high schools, and there is there is no courses about the Holocaust in history departments at Polish universities. This is a rhetorical questions almost, right? There, Eugenia Prokopianiec teaches at the Faculty of Polish Literature, right? Marek Kucia, sociologist, Jewish studies, of course, but how about huge history departments? It's a very big question. I think this goes from because it comes, it's like grassroots movements almost of academics and educators who have almost personal interest and personal belief that this is their mission, this is important, but it doesn't go from the top down, right? There is a Ministry of Higher Education, for example, right? Why it's missing at the pedagogical university, pedagogical schools. So that's why this gap is growing, actually. There is debates are around elites, And this is sad, this is very pessimistic, but I have to report it, right? Because numbers are numbers. So I think we should lobby our governments, right? Our ministries. It's still quite centralized educational systems. The universities in Poland, they have intellectual freedom. But this is Zdzisław Mach established Holocaust studies section in 1998 because him and Professor Jonathan Weber, two anthropologists, believe it's important for European identity. Not historians thought about it. Okay, thank you.
One more comment, and we will finish.
About the Minsk and this pogrom. Last week I gave a talk in Yad Vashem about what the Nazis did with the Pshitik pogrom. It turned out that the Nazis did quite many things. Before the war, they sent an agent and spy to the town. At the beginning of the war, they used the Pshitik pogrom in newspapers around the General Gouvernement to say, remember what was in Pshitik. I didn't see anything about the other pogroms. And then in 1942, they did an action of all the butchers in the Radom district, there was not any other such action in other places in the general government. And these butchers, some of them actually were part of the resistance movement in the pogrom, and they wanted to know what was in Pshitik. 2 weeks after the Wannsee conference, they wanted to know everything about the Jews in Pshitik. So the Nazis made some lessons from the pogrom. So it does have meaning, even if it's not called a pogrom, or they found that it was interesting because of the Jewish defense.
Well, thank you very much for this fascinating session, and we continue our talk over the cafe, preparing for